hotel worker and mother who was stabbed to death by an illegal immigrant from Sudan. Shocked the whole country.
In one of the most emotionally devastating and politically explosive moments we have witnessed in British politics, a grieving mother whose daughter was murdered while working at an asylum hotel has publicly accused the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of having blood on his hands. And the accusation is not hyperbolic rage or political point-scoring, but a carefully considered indictment from a woman who has lost everything because the government that Keir Starmer leads failed to protect British citizens from dangers it knew existed, dangers it was warned about repeatedly, and dangers it chose to ignore because addressing them honestly would have been politically inconvenient and ideologically uncomfortable. This is not about immigration policy in the abstract or theoretical debates about border control. This is about a young woman who went to work one morning and never came home because someone who should never have been in this country, who had a violent criminal history that should have disqualified them from asylum, was placed in the very hotel where she worked, and the consequences were fatal, preventable, and absolutely devastating for a family that will never be whole again. You need to subscribe to British Mirror immediately and hit that notification bell right now, because this story cuts to the absolute heart of what is wrong with Britain's asylum system and why the political establishment's refusal to confront uncomfortable truths is literally costing British lives. And every single person needs to hear this mother's story and understand exactly what Starmer's government is responsible for. Let's establish the facts of this case clearly and precisely, because the details matter enormously, and because there will inevitably be attempts to obscure what actually happened. A young woman in her 20s was working at a hotel that had been converted into asylum accommodation, one of hundreds across Britain where migrants awaiting asylum decisions are housed at taxpayer expense. Her job involved basic administrative and hospitality duties, the kind of work thousands of young people do across the country. On the day she was killed, an asylum seeker with a documented history of violent behavior attacked her with a knife in an assault so brutal that emergency services could not save her life. She died at the scene. The perpetrator was arrested, charged, and the facts of the case are not in dispute. What is very much in dispute is how someone with known violent tendencies was allowed into Britain, given asylum accommodation, and placed in a situation where they had access to vulnerable workers. The mother's statement, delivered with extraordinary dignity given her unimaginable grief, was devastating in its clarity. She did not rant or rage incoherently. She methodically outlined how the Home Office had been warned about this specific individual, how staff at the asylum hotel had raised concerns about his behavior, how those warnings were ignored by bureaucrats more concerned with processing numbers than protecting people, and how her daughter paid the ultimate price for that bureaucratic failure. Then she looked directly into the camera and said that Keir Starmer, as Prime Minister and the person ultimately responsible for immigration and asylum policy, has blood on his hands. The accusation echoes because it is true, because it is specific, and because no amount of political spin can make it go away. The government's response has been predictably inadequate. Official statements expressed sympathy for the family, promised full investigations, and insisted that lessons would be learned. Except we have heard all of this before. Every time something goes catastrophically wrong with the asylum system, every time there is a preventable tragedy, we get the same hollow promises about learning lessons and improving processes, and then absolutely nothing changes. The system continues operating in exactly the same dysfunctional way. More people arrive with inadequate vetting, more concerns get ignored, and eventually another tragedy occurs. The cycle is maddening, and it is killing people. What makes this particular case so politically explosive is that it exposes every single weakness in how Britain currently handles asylum claims. The perpetrator in this case had a criminal record in his home country that should have immediately disqualified him from asylum. He had demonstrated violent behavior during his journey to Britain and while in temporary accommodation. Multiple warning signs existed that this was not someone who should be granted protection, but someone who posed a danger. And yet he was allowed to remain, housed in a hotel with civilian workers and given the opportunity to kill. Every single stage of the process failed, and those failures are not random accidents, but the inevitable consequence of a system designed to prioritize speed and numbers over safety and scrutiny. The use of hotels for asylum accommodation has been controversial from the start, and this tragedy illustrates exactly why. Hotels are not designed to be secure facilities for housing potentially dangerous individuals. Staff are not trained in managing people with complex needs or violent histories. There are no proper security measures, no adequate oversight, no meaningful risk assessment. You're essentially taking random asylum seekers, many of whom have no documentation, no verified backgrounds, and no established identities, and placing them in commercial hotels alongside minimum wage workers who have no protection whatsoever. It is a disaster waiting to happen, and now it has happened, and a young woman is dead. The political dimension of this tragedy cannot be separated from the human dimension, because the reason the system operates this way is political choice, not necessity. The government could implement rigorous vetting. They could refuse asylum to anyone with violent criminal histories. They could detain dangerous individuals rather than housing them in public hotels. They could prioritize the safety of British citizens over the convenience of processing asylum claims quickly. But all of those options are politically difficult because they require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the risks associated with mass asylum migration, and that acknowledgement would contradict the progressive narrative that dominates immigration discourse in Westminster and the media. Keir Starmer's specific culpability here is that he has consistently opposed measures that would have prevented this tragedy. He voted against tougher asylum rules when in opposition. He criticized the Rwanda scheme, designed to deter dangerous channel crossings. He has positioned himself as compassionate on immigration, while dismissing concerns about safety and vetting as racist fear-mongering. And now his approach has gotten someone killed, and he has to face a grieving mother who is holding him personally accountable. There is no comfortable position for him here, no way to spin this that makes him look like anything other than a politician whose ideological commitments mattered more than protecting British lives. The broader asylum crisis context makes this even more damning. Britain is currently experiencing record levels of asylum applications, with tens of thousands arriving via illegal channel crossings each year. The processing system is completely overwhelmed, with massive backlogs and waiting times stretching into years. The use of hotels for accommodation has cost taxpayers billions of pounds. And throughout all of this chaos, the one thing that should be absolutely paramount, rigorous safety vetting to ensure dangerous individuals are not given access to British communities, has been completely neglected. The priorities are backwards, the system is broken, and British citizens are paying the price. The accusation of having blood on your hands is about as serious as political accusations get. It is not suggesting incompetence or poor judgment. It is asserting direct moral responsibility for someone's death. When that accusation comes not from a political opponent, but from a bereaved mother whose daughter was murdered as a direct consequence of government policy failures, it carries weight that cannot be dismissed or deflected. Starmer can issue all the sympathetic statements he wants, but he cannot escape the fact that his government's approach to asylum directly contributed to creating the circumstances in which this young woman was killed. The media coverage of this story has been revealing in what it prioritizes and what it downplays. Some outlets have focused heavily on the mother's accusation and the policy failures it highlights. Others have been notably reluctant to engage with the immigration policy implications, preferring to treat it as an isolated tragedy rather than a systemic failure. The instinct in parts of the media to avoid difficult conversations about asylum and immigration, even when British citizens are being killed, is itself part of the problem. When truthful discussion of policy failures is considered too politically sensitive to report honestly, the failures continue and more people die. The public reaction has been one of fury and heartbreak. The comments on social media, the discussions in communities across Britain, the conversations happening in workplaces and homes are expressing a level of anger at the political establishment that feels genuinely dangerous to the stability of the system. People are not just disagreed with government policy, they are furious that their concerns have been dismissed, that warnings have been ignored, and that British citizens are dying because politicians prioritize ideology over safety. This kind of anger does not dissipate quickly, and it has serious electoral consequences. For the asylum workers still employed at hotels across Britain, this tragedy is a terrifying reminder of the risks they face every single day. They work